So in our next panel, manuscripts and digital scripts, we have 3 speakers talking about 3 different projects, whether Dickens or otherwise. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Mel Evans, a lecturer in English language at the University of Leicester. She's co-investigator on the AHRC project Editing Aphra Behn in the Digital Age, and she's editing Behn's spying letters for the new Cambridge edition. And I'll hand over to Mel now.
Okay, hi everybody. Yeah, the question I just asked was a loaded question because we're drawing to the end of our project, so it was interesting to hear the responses. Okay, I shall just share my screen. Okay, can you see some slides? Are they showing?
Oh yes, they are. Yeah.
Yeah, they're brilliant. Cool. Okay, so yes, I'm here to talk about our HRC funded project, Editing Aphra Behn in the Digital Age. So Aphra Behn, for those of you who haven't met her yet, she was a 17th century writer, one of the first professional women writers to work in the English language, and as well as making translations from other languages. And she was also a one-time royalist spy, which an activity I will get back to later. She's perhaps best known for her play, The Rover, as well as her short prose fiction, Arunico. And a lot of the writing that she produced is very kind of current themes and resonances around gender, sexuality, political autonomy, and race. So the project itself was HRC funded from 2016 to 2020, although because of COVID, we've had an extension to 2022, hopefully to hold the end of project conference that was due to take place in April last year. And obviously that hasn't happened. There's a core team of us involved in the project. Various postdocs have been involved at different stages. And the project was kind of geared towards producing a new scholarly edition of the writings of Aphra Behn. It's going to be produced in 8 volumes with Cambridge University Press. If I move slightly to my, like you can see the first volume is the red book just behind us. That was the first volume, volume 4, which came out last year. And in doing so, in creating this new edition, we wanted to develop new approaches to understanding Behn's contexts, and in particular to explore the opportunities for digital approaches to Behn's writing, and also kind of scholarship around that and public engagement activities as well. So Aphra Behn in the Digital Age is what we might call a digitally informed edition. And this comes down to kind of several facets of the project. The first of these is the style and attribution analysis, which is what my role is primarily has been on the project, which is investigating Behn's style, Behn's authorship and attribution questions about what she wrote and did not write. We've also had elements to do with an online editing workbench, obviously using digital resources in a way that when Janet Dodd did her fine edition back in the 90s just weren't available, so EBO and other online collections. As well as undertaking public engagement activities. So again, we were due to have an exhibit at the National Archives, that place in Kew, but that's been transformed into a digital exhibit, a digital video that's available on YouTube about Behn and particularly her activities as a spy in Antwerp. But it's very much not a digital edition, and that in itself is a decision that is probably worth a paper and discussion, but not the one I'm going to be talking with you about today. So my kind of main contribution to the project thus far has been exploring what I've called, in kind of the spirit of today, Behn's authorial codes. And you'll notice the plural there. I'm going to come back to that. So Behn's works are generically diverse. She produced them over a 20-year career. And there's very little manuscript evidence of her literary writing. Most of it was, almost all of it is in fact in print editions only. The manuscripts we do have are from her spying letters held in the state papers and a few other personal documents. And despite being a very prolific author and having a kind of well-recognized and respectable canon, if you like, canon of writing that are Behn's texts, there are also many problematic texts as well that, as editors of an edition, we have to decide, well, what goes in and what does not, and how confident can we be when talking about, if you like, Behn's aims or Behn's ideas and what she wanted for this particular text. So to give you a sense of how that breaks down, this table just shows you the different genres that Behn worked in. So kind of the 6 categories, very broad in themselves. And you can see in the first column what we've called securely attributed texts, those that were published in her lifetime with her name, if you like, on the title page, or in the case of the letters, written in her own hand. And then the ones that are questionable are those that were associated with her but didn't have her name on the title page or were published after she died. And in some of the categories, you can see there's almost a 50-50 split. And in some cases, the balance is entirely weighted away from those that are secure and those that are indeed much more questionable. So how do we solve this problem? How can we make kind of any assured, informed discussions and decisions about Behn's works, what we are classifying as going into Behn's works in the edition? Well, our approach has been threefold. One has been traditional archival work. Another one has been obviously a lot of kind of scholarly discussion and thinking and reflection within the project team, and obviously the people who know so much more about Behn than I do, kind of all that collective wisdom, obviously engaging with the works themselves, but again, in distinction to perhaps earlier projects on Behn, throwing a computer at it as well. This computer, by the way, is far too optimistic for its own good, and needs to show a little bit more kind of humbleness in its approach. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of what we have managed to do so far in the project, using kind of computational approaches to Behn's authorship and style. So there are 5 questionable plays that Behn perhaps wrote. And in order to investigate these, we have to compare them obviously with what we know Behn did write, as well as works by other people writing at the time. We don't have any other kind of explicit alternative candidates, if you like, to these 5 questionable plays. It's just someone has said during her lifetime or just after it, oh, she probably wrote that. This feels a bit like Behn. So what we've done is prepared a corpus of Behn's plays and those by her contemporaries using TEI-XML, based fortunately on EBO TCP or visualizing English print texts, unlike later periods where you're all reliant on OCR. Because of EBO TCP, we do at least have the kind of print text in a text format already that can be edited, which is nice. Our approach, though, is focusing on, if you like, what makes up Behn's authorial code, what makes her distinctive. So many tests and investigations have shown that you can often isolate an author's work from that of another author on the basis of the words or the letters that they choose to use, habitually, subconsciously, kind of at the core level of what we might call someone's style. So we've looked at various ways of exploring this, different statistical tests, and tried to complement it with other perspectives from within linguistics, stylistics, and literary studies. So to give you a taster, one of the Jubia plays that we've looked at is something called The Revenge. And as you can see in the image, this is a snapshot of the raw frequencies, the normalized frequencies, the proportions of use of the words that are in the left column in plays by Behn and her contemporaries in the corpus. And then there are various statistical treatments that you can use to assess how all of these words collectively distribute in one text and how that differentiates them from another and another and another, or indeed by an author and another author and another author. And when it comes to The Revenge, with a method called delta, which now is a very loaded word whenever I say it, but this is delta pre the current situation we're in. The lower the score, the more like the text it is. So this is measuring how much like the Revenge is to different plays by different authors. Plays in blue are by Behn. Okay, so in the case of The Revenge, we get very much all arrows are pointing in the same direction, in that The Revenge is very much like Behn's other plays. Okay, and just as a test, I've included the Town Fop, which is this one here. And this is a play that we know Behn wrote, and you can see the profile is very similar. So this is a kind of very nice clear-cut way about how kind of using words, counting words, looking at word frequencies, how they distribute, can give us a kind of a quite a strong persuasive indicator of likeness at a kind of linguistic level. But to give you a counter example, another play, The Counterfeit Bridegroom, has been much less clear-cut. So The Counterfeit Bridegroom was based on Thomas Middleton's play from earlier in the 17th century. And so here we have the potential risk of interference. So you're looking for, is this play by Behn, but also is this play that's been kind of, to what extent is this play still like that by Middleton, because his original will be interfering and appearing in all kinds of ways. And again, we tried different methods, and what we find is that actually in these kinds of texts, differentiating the authorial codes is much more tricky. Here, Middleton, shown by the hashed red lines, dominates in this play, particularly in the first 3 acts. And that's because whoever wrote The Counterfeit Bridegroom was very lazy and actually didn't bother changing much. You know, the dialogue is mashed up, but there's still the kind of core Middleton play text underlying it. And so these are kind of some of the problematic questions that when you're trying to investigate kind of authorial style that we're continuing to grapple with. And I want to return now, just for the final few minutes, to the question of Behn's authorial codes, and the reason I'm using a plural. So I've been talking so far about kind of comparing Behn with her contemporaries when looking at drama. And this table shows you, if you like, the most frequent words in Behn's writing overall, and the most frequent words in a contemporary corpus of drama overall. However, it's important to realise that genre has a massive impact, and that the questions and methods that we're using for one genre are not applicable necessarily to those of another. So Behn's style, you know, it doesn't necessarily have a coherent heart, it seems, at the moment, because she differs so much depending on what she's writing for, what style she's writing in. And this is something that is reflective of many literary writers, but for Behn seems particularly acute, it seems particularly an issue. So where are we at in the project now as we're drawing to the end of our funded period? Well, there's still lots for me to do. I'm going to be kept quite busy, I think, over the next decade or so. We have to investigate Behn's prose writing and deal with the fact that the length of the texts that are by her are much, much shorter than those that are questionable. We have to investigate her poetry when we have factors of poetic convention interfering with word frequencies, and also obviously the issue of massively divergent text lengths. And last but not least, given the interest in manuscripts for today's symposium, is Behn's spying letters. So Behn wrote these letters when she went to Antwerp as a spy, and she was sent there by the king to recruit William Scott, who was an Englishman who was currently serving in the Dutch army, and she was sent there to try and turn him double agent, purportedly on the basis that they used to have a relationship when she was in Suriname. So yeah, I told you she was interesting. And Behn's spying career was short-lived, and there is possibly a reason for this. So here's the connection, if you like, with the kind of the previous papers from today. Behn was instructed to use cipher. These were kind of the letters, the intelligence information she sent back was politically charged. However, perhaps reflective of her short career in spying, she wasn't particularly good at using the cipher, and even complained that it was too cumbersome and lengthy, and they needed to have a better version. Here, try this. So these letters are kind of, you know, they don't need decoding. The officers in the state papers, kind of in the secretary's office, sorry, did it all for us already in the state, that's recorded in the state papers documents. However, there is one final conundrum that shows even reliable documents such as this are problematic. These are autograph letters by Behn sent to various people back in London. And in these letters, she writes out the letters that Scott has sent her, apparently because he is worried that if they spot his handwriting, they'll figure out what's going on and that he's turned on the Dutch and he's acting as a double agent. So Behn writes them all out in her own hand and sends them on to London. But Nadine Ackerman, quite fairly, has asked, well, did these letters from Scott actually exist at all? So we have these texts by Scott that Behn wrote and writes around in her own letters saying, this is what Scott wrote, quote. Nadine said, well, actually, did she not just fabricate all of them? Is this not actually the start of her literary career back in 1666? Which is a wonderful question, but is entirely problematic when you've got to work with the limits of historical data. So watch this space. Final kind of comments. One thing that we found as a project is that digital progress, any kind of digital element, is wonderfully rich and diverse, and we found out lots of things, but it's also very slow and complicated. So anyone kind of doing a digital project, give yourself time to do data preparation more than the analysis. Give yourself time for that, and when you're doing the analysis, what we've found is that an interdisciplinary perspective has been absolutely key. Be prepared to have to look at things, but then turn them down as well. Focus on what needs to be done within the project scope and save everything else for kind of after the project has ended, is what I would suggest. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that really fascinating exploration of things Aphra Behn did or didn't write. There's a lot to discuss there. Our next speaker is Philip Schofield, who's director of the Bentham project. He's edited or co-edited a dozen volumes of the collected works of Jeremy Bentham, and he'll be talking about the Transcribe Bentham project.
Right, thank you very much indeed. And I hope you can see my screen. And Transcribe Bentham is our scholarly crowdsourcing project. And when we're thinking about, what do people in general know about Bentham, the first thing is probably the Panopticon prison. And here is a sketch of the Panopticon, which
oh, sorry, we can't see your screen.
Okay, sorry. Let me try and work out what's happening. Right, I'll try again. Screen 2. Have I got it this time?
Yes, we can see it now.
Sorry, thank you. Anyway, here's a diagram of the Panopticon prison from about from the 1790s, produced by the architect Willie Reevely. I don't know whether Reevely was cheap or the fact he just lived around the corner from Bentham, but the distinctive feature of the Panopticon is the idea that there are cells for the inmates around the outside of the building, and in the centre you have an inspection tower where the prisoners can be seen, but the inspector himself cannot be seen. And the other aspect that of Bentham that we thought were perhaps aware of was his auto icon. Here in his new box, where he was installed just a couple of years ago in the new student centre at UCL. And this was is Bentham's skeleton dressed in his own clothes. Bentham died in 1832 and ordered that his auto icon be created, and then eventually he was the auto icon came to be donated to University College London. Now the Bentham project was established in 1959 because UCL, apart from having Bentham's auto icon, also has his manuscripts, or at least the vast majority of them. And there are about 80,000 pages of Bentham's manuscripts in the UCL library, and another 15,000 or so in the British Library. In the 19th century, John Bowring, Bentham's literary executor, produced a scholarly, an edition of Bentham's works, just called The Works of Jeremy Bentham. It was published between 1838 and 1843. And by the 1930s, it was decided that the Bowring edition was not suitable for scholarly work. And so it was decided then to bring out a new edition of Bentham's writings based both on the manuscripts and also on the texts that Bentham himself printed in his own lifetime. The Second World War intervened, and eventually the idea of a Bentham project was re-established, and the project was eventually set up in 1959. The first volumes were produced in 1968, and to date we've produced 34 of, well, what I conservatively estimate will be 80 volumes by the time the edition is finished, if it ever does get finished. The volumes themselves are based on two sources, the manuscripts themselves and also the texts that Bentham printed and published in his lifetime. And we reckon there are probably about 40 or 50 texts that Bentham published, ranging from pamphlets of 8 pages through to the massive Rationale of Judicial Evidence, which is 2,500 pages, and which poor John Stuart Mill edited when he was about 19 years old. So we have, let's say, around 100,000 pages of manuscript. We say there are about 80,000 manuscript pages, but in the UCL collection, and 15,000 pages in the British Library. And we started transcribing these manuscripts onto disc in about 1985, and by the mid 20noughties, we transcribed about 20,000 pages. And so we worked out that at the rate we were going, it was going to take us another 60 years to transcribe them. So we got a small grant in order to see whether we could crowdsource the transcription of Bentham's manuscripts. Now, at the time, crowdsourcing was associated, as we've already heard about Zooniverse, with what seemed to be fairly straightforward and perhaps repetitive tasks, such as correcting OCR. And here are a few examples of the various crowdsourcing projects which have existed and been well known. And as I say, they were fairly repetitive tasks, and we were wondering whether it would be possible to get volunteers to transcribe Bentham's manuscripts. And here are some examples of Bentham's manuscripts. Most of these are from the early period of his life, so the handwriting isn't bad at all, but as you can see, they're full of interlineations where Bentham either has added some text or has you put forward an alternative, crossings out, and so forth. And the interesting point here is that all the manuscripts I'm showing you now have been transcribed by volunteers. And so, as I say, the Transcribe Bentham was set up in late 2010, initially as a 6-month experiment to see whether we could get people to transcribe Bentham's manuscripts. And even this particular manuscript was transcribed by a volunteer. I mean, what's remarkable is that somebody would take the time, hours, to sit down and work through a manuscript such as this. Fortunately, funding kept coming to us, and we got a grant from the Mellon Foundation to continue our work with scholarly crowdsourcing in order to see whether the whole idea was economical, whether it was actually cheaper to use the crowd to at least begin transcription, as opposed to using experts within the Bentham project. And we worked out as best we could, not being accountants, but we reckon that if we got initial transcripts of the whole Bentham manuscripts done by volunteers, we'd probably save getting on for £1 million at the prices in the mid 2010s. The way the program works is through a transcription desk, and volunteers have now to date transcribed nearly 30,000 pages of Bentham's manuscripts. As I say, we were fortunate to get a grant from the Mellon Foundation, and then we got involved in 2 European Union projects over 6.5 years, which led to the production of the Transcriptorium tool, which uses handwritten text recognition very successfully to read historical manuscripts. What we were hoping to do was to combine HTR with crowdsourcing, so that volunteers would be able either to transcribe a manuscript from scratch, or else ask the machine to give it, to give the volunteer an image, to a transcript of an image, and then for the volunteer to correct the transcript. Unfortunately, that combination of crowdsourcing and HTR has not so far developed. But here's our transcription desk, and we not only ask volunteers to transcribe manuscripts, but also to add text encoding initiative tags. And so the complex task of reading Bentham's manuscripts, often on very complex philosophical subjects, plus adding tags, sounds like a sort of a recipe for disaster. But as I say, we've had about 30,000, nearly 30,000 manuscripts pages transcribed to date. And I mean, one or two of our speakers have mentioned about how you maintain projects over the long term. It is a problem, both technologically, because at the moment we're using a media wiki in the background, and I'm told by our computer experts that we really need to update that, because there are a few people now who understand media wiki, and it's also got certain technical limitations. And also, you know, the reputational damage from getting people involved and then closing the program down. In fact, lockdown has worked to our advantage, in that we found a greater uptake in Transcribe Bentham. People, I suppose, have a little bit more time on their hands, and so people are transcribing at perhaps as fast a rate as they've ever done. But what we found is that it's just a very small number of people who virtually do all the work. But you just need a few dedicated volunteers to get an awful lot of work done. And we recognise the volunteers' contribution by mentioning their names in the printed volumes when they eventually are published. So we used the volunteer transcripts as a starting point for our own editorial work. And just one last thing to share with you, that even in the Bentham manuscripts there is some shorthand, and here's an example of we think that, well, this was written by John Bowring, Bentham's literary executor, when he was being dictated to by Bentham. And we have another example, if I can find it, of a manuscript which we haven't deciphered. The one I've just shown you was deciphered back in the early 1980s, and so we have a transcript of that. But there's also an image here of a very late manuscript, with probably 1832, just before Bentham's death, talking about his health. We think it's possibly written by Edwin Chadwick, who was Bentham's secretary at the time, and at various points he starts writing in shorthand. Whether this was to be fast, or whether it was because it was delicate information, well, we don't know until somebody's able to read it for us. So anyway, there's sort of my brief overview of Transcribe Bentham, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. And it's fascinating how many of these writers were using shorthand, and as people have said, that it goes back beyond some other forms that we're more comfortable with now, and we've somehow lost this ability to read it. Our final speaker in this session is John Drew, who is Professor of English Literature at the University of Buckingham and directs the International Digital Humanities Research Project, Dickens Journals Online. And I will hand over to John now.
Hi, Emily, can you hear me? Good. Just going to share my screen. And hopefully you can, if you could, I can see you, Emily and Hugo. If you can nod, if you can see my slides, that's great. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to explain what the project was about, but it's just nice to be invited, because in some ways this is quite old hat as a Dickens project, and we are coming up for the 10th anniversary of our release, and a lot changes in the digital world in 10 years, I can tell you. But originally, the project was to digitize the weekly journals edited by Dickens for the last 20 years of his life, 1850 through 1870, and those formed the basis of my my PhD back in the 90s. And for several years, life consisted of traveling by underground or bike to Senate House and calling up these sort of hoary old volumes. And this is well before there's the advent of the home computer. I was able to afford an Amstrad in my final year of study. But basically, I would take time to wait for the volumes to be delivered to me. And this is a page of my handwritten notes trying to establish a table of contents, which the journals didn't have, to see how the original installments of A Tale of Two Cities intercalated with the other myriad contents of each week's installment. And so the approach for the project was to try and develop an online edition that would sort of compensate for some of these difficulties, a digital periodical that would show you a transcript, sorry, a facsimile of the original page, and then a really clean cut and pastable transcript. We wanted to have author information in there, as well as a table of contents and a genre and subject index. So that was the aim, and what worked well. I think it was the volunteer community effort to transcribe the machine-read transcription from OCR, the optical character recognition, which, as we all know, produces mistakes, not quite as many as in this illustration, but OCR quality back in 2009-10 wasn't what it is now. And there was quite a lot of what Philip has rightly called sort of straightforward and repetitive work, yes, but the volunteers got to read the contents of the journals as well, and that was the great payoff for them. Now, amazingly, most commercial or PFI digital periodical newspaper projects are still sitting on top of a large quantity of uncorrected OCR, and the percentage accuracy is still quite a closely guarded secret. There are, huge implications for search accuracy and the suitability of digitized periodicals for quantitative research as a result. So our project involved the manual correction of about 30 million words of text, and we called up participants. I mean, I'm not sure that we would use that illustration now, post 2018 reflection on the centenary of the end of the First World War, but that was the image we used back then, and it seemed to produce results. And we specifically avoided using that rather slick term, crowdsourcing, and which seems to have escaped from the corporate boardroom. And we use this more cumbersome public collaborative text correction terminology. Participants were given a simple editor to use, reading across from the original page image to correct mistranscriptions. And then we soon found we needed to develop a moderator interface so that those volunteers who were qualified to check another volunteer's work could report back on the quality and accept for publication or reject return for more work in certain areas. The challenge initially was, having developed this, was to find enough volunteers to get sort of critical mass. And we had a bar chart showing in the far left there, after about sort of 9 months of having released the interface, that there was an awful lot of work, 969 magazines left unassigned. But exactly 10 years ago, give or take a couple of weeks, a letter to The Guardian during what I think is still the silly season for journalism, when the senior editors are off on holiday and junior editors are allowed to publish quirky things. We had a letter in the Guardian, and then a slot on IPM, and then a full page in the Observer, and quite quickly the bar chart began to shift, and then some further publicity in Spain and the Netherlands and Australia. And, you know, this is the remarkable thing: within about 72 hours, the majority of the work, that's the second brown column, was taken on and assigned. So that's sort of August 2011, Dickens bicentenary coming up February 2012. And I suppose the significance for us of this project was within 6 months, by the time of the bicentenary, the whole transcription correction was complete. What did we learn? Well, we're looking here at the audience overview, and that's the massive spike on the 6th of August 2011, when it got into the sort of online and into the press. And look, that is the period of greatest involvement. Since then, it's not that we've flatlined. We've got a steady stream of about 100 people a day checking in and using the sites, and that's very consistent. But I suppose if you think about it, those initial 6 months, they were supposed to be the means to an end. But in fact, that was the period of greatest sort of imaginative and intellectual engagement with the project. And since then, we've been trying to find ways to get back to that level of involvement. And so we've done some re-serializations of serial novels, allowing the public to come in and blog about each installment without reading ahead. We've run a creative writing competition and sort of recreated a new issue of Household Words and typeset and published that. But in a way, we're still looking for how to get back to that level of involvement. I'm just picking out some other stats here before I come to my final slide. You know, 10 years on, what's the legacy? What are future plans? We have learned that we need to credit, you know, it was really helpful to have a leaderboard, an idea we took from the Australian newspapers digitisation project, wonderfully well written up by Rose Holly. So the leaderboard, just a way of acknowledging everybody who was contributing, and each magazine still has an acknowledgement, as you would find in a print book, for the work that the volunteers had done. We've found that everywhere in the world is now using Dickens journals online, but future plans must surely include finding out what's going wrong in the Svalbard archipelago and in Chad and Central African Republic, where we have no users at all. And sustainability questions. You know, is it right that such a resource should be owned by a small and not very wealthy independent university, or the English department of such a university? It hangs by a thread, and so I'm interested in what Bob was saying about plans for the next 10 years, the next 50 years, what's going to happen. And I will leave you with the irony that currently, as we speak, if you tried to log on to djo.org.uk, you'd get an error message telling you that the site is down. So yes, if we get it back up, when we get it back up, I think the great thing for the future will be to devise a way that there's always a job, a little task something for somebody to do every time they drop in, not just to to read and take something for research, but a chance, rather than say contributing some money to the future of the site, actually doing something to develop the site further. And those would be my takeaways for the Dickens Code.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all three of our speakers. So I'd now like to take 5 minutes or so for questions, so please do type any questions into the chat. I'm just scrolling in. So there was a question I think Philip already answered about the system used Bentham's shorthand, which was private shorthand, so another person who's got an idiosyncratic style. It was really interesting to hear both from Philip and from John about the involvement of people and kind of the tasks that they were set, although there's kind of those peaks in involvement. And it's interesting that a few volunteers, as Philip said, were doing a lot of the work for the Bentham project. Was that the case for the Dickens Journals Online as well, that there were a few people doing a lot of the work?
Yes, absolutely, and so our moderators tended to be those. They would correct 2 or 3 magazines, individual magazines of 24 pages themselves. They would do it well, and they would be, as it were, bumped up to being a super corrector, and they would then moderate others' work. And I think something I meant to mention when running through my slides was that we found it was really important. I'd love to know Philip's experience. Really important always to mediate between super correctors rather than let them communicate directly with one another. And I hope that doesn't sound too paternalistic, but we found it necessary to be super courteous, super polite at all times. Not like working with a colleague who's an employee. And to mediate between the volunteers, because there are extraordinary rivalries and a kind of competitiveness, I think, that's quite interesting. But to avoid friction, that's what we found. We would always, as it were, relay messages rather than allowing volunteers to communicate directly, unless they were coming to one of our forums or conferences.
No, that's interesting, because one of the ideas we had originally was that we would have some of our more experienced volunteers act as moderator, but that hasn't happened. And so one of the we have a member of Bentham project staff who does all the checking, and so yeah, so we haven't got into that situation. And we did try and set up a forum for our users to interact, and that didn't work either. They were much more interested in just sort of, in a sense, getting on with it, with themselves, but they did like interaction with the professional staff at the Bentham project.
Thank you. I was also struck between Philip, the Transcribe software, the Transcribe software that's used for the Bentham project, and Mel, what you were talking about in trying to work out the authorship of the particular things. And I wondered, Mel, if you could talk a bit more about the particular tools that you were using to try and ascertain that created those graphs.
Yeah. So there's a range of software tools and packages that you can use. So some of them you run through R, and some of them that we've used have run through Hugh Craig's software called Intelligent Archive, which is entirely designed for this kind of computational stylistic approach. We decided not to, they're much bigger minds than ours kind of working on these things, and one of them will be speaking later. So, rather than reinvent the wheel, it's a case of what we've done is try to draw lots of different approaches to investigating style and authorship. And then if everything points in the same direction, then we'll take that as being a kind of quite strong evidence that, okay, we're on the right tracks, and either it is or it isn't like Behn. And also we were very interested in making sure that we were investigating Behn's style for its own purposes as well, and what that can tell us about linguistic creativity and kind of creativity across her lifetime, across the lifespan, if you like. So questions that weren't solely restricted to questions of authorship, although that was the kind of functional end goal, if you like.
Thank you. And I wondered if really all of you could reflect on how you digitally record ambiguity and change. So with the Dickens journals, was there a versioning process? What was the approval process like? And then with these cases where you have works by Behn, works that might be by Behn, or with the transcribing of handwriting, those layers of possible transcription, how do you digitally go about representing ambiguity like that?
Well, I think our project, if I may just jump in, was so simple and relatively primitive. You'd think it would be easy. You've got your original page, and you're trying to recreate that. But I could just mention, of course, that unless your instructions are crystal clear, you're going to get volunteers going down the wrong path. So we did have an instalment of Hard Times where the corrector had very carefully taken Stephen Blackpool's Lancashire dialect and corrected it to standard English, which was not what was expected. And then we also began to wonder also about the status of the original mistranscription, particularly where it gave you interesting variants that meant something different. Should we be recording that? But no, we just marched ahead and corrected it to what the page originally seemed to say. But there were lots of aspects that we could have recorded as we went along. But a low budget project with a deadline, we tended to go for a fairly simple objective.
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, we ask volunteers to mark text that is above the line or text that's in the margin, without trying to come to any decisions about what the status of that text might be, and that we pass on to the editorial part of the project. And I mean, our purpose is to produce an authoritative edition, and not so much to produce transcripts of manuscripts. I mean, what we produce in the volumes are coherent texts derived from the manuscripts, and not just transcripts. So there comes a point, and I think this is what John's driving at. You know, funds are not unlimited. In fact, they're very limited, and so we in a sense we have to cut corners. I know I do when I'm taking transcripts. When I'm editing them, I make a decision as to whether an interlineation is an addition or an alternative to what's in the text, and that will then appear eventually in a volume as a clean sentence. So yeah, we're making editorial decisions on the basis of what we think is Bentham's final intentions. So that's the criteria we work to, both in terms of the organisation of the text and also the detailed, you know, should the comma go here or not? You know, from the whole structure of the text down to you know, the structure of a particular phrase or sentence. You know, what did Bentham finally intend? Which, of course, is not always easy to work out.
Have I got time to kind of add to that as well? Yeah, because it's interesting that you know, our approach for the Behn edition is the same. You know, it's Behn's original intentions is kind of what we're trying to get at. But one of the things we've ended up doing, because we're doing on the one hand the kind of computational stuff, and then we're doing the edition as well, is that actually we found there's much more scope for ambiguity in the edition than there is in the computational texts. And the examples I'm thinking of here are to do with spelling regularization, where we need to have regularized spelling where the form of the spelling of a word is the same and disambiguated across, because we're counting words and letter sequences. And so I've been doing quite a lot of work for my sins on Behn's use of interjections and interjections in the 17th century. So oh, ah, he, ah, ooh, each. And as you can imagine, the spellings of those words are very rich and diverse and very interesting, but we're having to make decisions about, oh, is that an O or is it an ah? Is that an ow or an ooh? And again, it's that kind of just, they're tiny, tiny decisions, but you're having to make them constantly as we're regularizing the corpus, because that's what we're counting. And it turns out interjections actually are authorially distinctive. And you can profile Behn compared to other contemporaries on the use of oh and ah and he, which makes the work worthwhile, at least. But yeah, so we found it very different. In the editions, you do have slightly more scope for at least a footnote to comment on that.
Thank you.
I just make one quick sentence, just say that we do talk now about an authoritative edition and not a definitive one.
Thank you. There is discussion in the chat, but I think we'll have to draw it to a close there. And hopefully our speakers can continue the conversation in the chat. But thank you all very much for those presentations. We have a break now. It's a comment and coffee break, as the last one was. And the question which I put into the chat is the question that we'd like you to think about, which is, which creative crowdsourcing and digital humanities projects inspire you? And please do give them a shout out in the chat.